There's been reports that we've been nerfed into the ground and gutted.
This last month, the gaming world was stunned by the news that id Software, on the eve of releasing their DLC campaign for Doom: The Dark Ages, had suffered massive layoffs, with reports claiming they had lost over 50% of their staff, what many proclaimed as a gutting of the studio. The internet outrage was immediate and ferocious, with many condemning id's parent company, Microsoft, with rampant rumors and speculation that id was being turned into a support studio, its IDTech engine was being shelved, and worst of all, that this was the brutal end of the historic 35-year-old studio and its franchises. What's up, everybody? I'm Kirk, and this is the State of the Boom, your monthly recap for FPS news, releases, and a look at upcoming titles. And this episode's news segment is entirely dedicated to the id Software layoffs, why the layoffs happened, what the response from Microsoft and id Software has been, as well as the responses from current and former id employees, the status of the IDTech engine, and what the future holds for id's franchises, in particular, Doom. While I will be offering some of my own opinions and speculation, my goal here is to present the facts of this whole debacle as best I can from the sources available. Although please note, there are still a lot of questions and unknowns regarding these layoffs and the future of id Software. Okay, let's start from the beginning. On July 6th, it was announced that 96 id Software employees in Dallas County, Texas were being laid off, with an additional 40 remote workers also being laid off, making for a total of 136. This information was provided by the Texas government through their Worker Adjustment and Retraining Notices, also known as WARN. At the time of the WARN being issued, it was believed that id was operating with around 185 employees before the layoffs, which means they lost roughly 2/3 of their workforce with only 49 employees left. Now, the source of that 185-person headcount stems from the news last December that id Software had unionized under the Communication Workers of America, with 165 of their 185 employees signing union cards. However, the CWA did not state in their press releases that this was out of 185 employees. That information was put forth by gaming news outlets that broke the story, who themselves were going off of information received from the id Software unionizing committee. Keep this in mind as it will come into play later regarding the official id Software response. The layoffs came as a complete shock to the employees of id Software. They were given no warning whatsoever that the layoffs were coming, and worse yet, were given no real explanation for why they were happening. What made this especially painful was the fact that it came the day before id was going to launch Doom: The Dark Ages Revelations, which has since become one of the most acclaimed entries in the new Doom trilogy, both with critics and players. I for one loved it and did a 2-part review on it. What soon followed was an outcry from id fans, who saw the layoffs as a gutting of the famed 35-year-old studio, with some saying they had been nuked to be nothing more than a support studio, with others going as far as to consider it the end of the studio altogether. The CWA union is currently contesting the layoffs, and at the time of this video's upload are negotiating with Microsoft over severance protections and health benefit continuity. Although one sad and perhaps sinister aspect of these layoffs is that because the recently unionized studio had not yet ratified a contract, it lacked the contractually enforceable advance notice requirements. The CWA has filed an unfair labor practice charge alleging Xbox management was required to and failed to bargain with the union over the decision to lay off the workers.
For the past 25 years, Xbox has delivered some of the greatest games of all time. Games that changed what was possible, games that brought players together, and games that defined generations.
So why did this happen? Well, the inciting incident is the Great Xbox Reset, which was initiated by Xbox's new CEO, Asha Sharma. Following Xbox's rather positive showing at Summer Games Fest last June, Asha would soon come out and basically admit that the Xbox business was in trouble, claiming that some major changes and restructuring would be taking place. On July 6th, in an email put out company-wide, but also shared with the public through X, Asha Sharma would announce that 1,600 employees spread throughout Xbox's companies would be laid off effective immediately, with an additional 1,600 to be let go in the following year, a total of 3,200. id Software, of course, was among the companies affected that day, along with Activision, ZeniMax, Blizzard, King, Mojang, and Xbox Game Studios. Quote, "Our business today is not healthy. We are operating at margins that are 3 to 10 times lower than comparable platform and publishing businesses. We entered Gen 9 with a smaller install base and a higher cost structure. To grow, we bet on Game Pass, multi-platform, and a broader portfolio of content. While those businesses have created meaningful value, they did not grow at the pace we expected. As that happened, our core business weakened, we added more teams, more investment, and more time, hoping for a better outcome. And now the industry is facing the most severe hardware crisis in its history. We must reset Xbox." Real quick, it should be noted that the hardware crisis she mentioned, that some are calling the RAM-pocalypse, is partially being fueled by Microsoft's investment into AI infrastructure. Ain't that something? The email would confirm a divestment from 4 studios. Double Fine Productions and Compulsion Games worked out agreements to go independent, with Ninja Theory and Undead Labs being acquired by new investors. Arcane is also likely to be spun off or sold off, but is currently going through a mandatory evaluation in accordance to French labor laws. Now, I want to take a moment to put into further context why id Software being hit was so shocking. The studios that Xbox divested from, while talented and excellent in their own right, were not doing much for Xbox business-wise. Double Fine's games are rather niche and not big blockbuster hits. Same with Compulsion Games. While Ninja Theory's first Hellblade game was critically lauded and sold strong, its sequel was a sales disappointment. And Bleeding Edge, their 2020 live service game, was poorly received with support dropped a year later. While Undead Labs' State of Decay games have been successful, State of Decay 2 was launched way back in 2018, and its sequel has been in development for years now, having originally been announced in 2020, with a release targeting 2027. And Arcane had the disaster of Redfall from its now shuttered Austin studio, as well as reported development setbacks with Marvel's Blade. It should be noted, though, that despite some of these studios' titles not being profitable, their development was encouraged by former Xbox leadership so they could fill the Game Pass back catalog and encourage subscriptions. id Software, in comparison, has been doing fantastically. In the last 10 years, they have put out 3 very popular and critically acclaimed shooters in one of gaming's most popular and influential franchises, with successful DLCs in between. Business-wise, Doom 2016 and Eternal did very well, selling millions of copies, and while Doom the Dark Ages did not sell as well, that has largely been attributed to it being released day and date on Game Pass, as it hit 3 million players far quicker than its predecessors, 7 times faster than Doom Eternal according to them, making it the largest launch in id Software history. Not to mention developing 3 highly regarded iterations of the IDTech engine, which we'll be talking more about later. So yeah, when all of this is taken into account, it's baffling that Microsoft would, in the eyes of many, gut a studio that has been firing on all cylinders. So again, why did this happen? Is it punishment for them unionizing? Is it because Microsoft doesn't respect the studio or understand what their IP means to people? Did they see Doom the Dark Ages as a failure and other id IP as inconsequential? Well, while those points are debatable to some, and for all we know there could be some truth to them, the core reason I think is a lot simpler. It's to eliminate cost. The whole point of this big Xbox reset is to get the business quote-unquote healthy, and the first step of doing that is to eliminate overhead. While it may not seem like it, the fact of the matter is anything left in the Xbox ecosystem right now is seen by its executives as having value that can be exploited further, and they are hoping to do it faster, at a higher frequency, and at a lower cost. Essentially, they want to have their cake and eat it too. It has been reported that Asha Sharma wants to double down on the Xbox franchises that have been profitable. This, of course, means classics like Halo and Gears of War, but also heavy hitters like Minecraft, Call of Duty, and Candy Crush. And this certainly counts for the franchises under the ZeniMax Bethesda sphere, of which id Software belongs, being The Elder Scrolls, Fallout, Wolfenstein, Quake, and of course, Doom. Xbox wants more Doom, a lot more Doom, and they want it cheaper. Again, they want to have their cake and eat it too. The cold hard truth here is that if Xbox didn't think they could get anything out of id, they would have closed them down or sold them off, just like Double Fine, Compulsion, and what is soon to be Arcane. I think the executives in charge of these cuts looked at the id Software employee roster and decided the minimum they needed to develop their games, and went from there. I think it's about as cold and straightforward as that. And this is me editorializing, but the people who did these cuts are likely those who care little about game development talent, or have little knowledge on building and maintaining a synergistic team that can successfully ship a quality game on time. These are the kind of people that are going strictly by the numbers on a spreadsheet, and likely see developers as part of a machine that can easily be taken away or replaced with cheaper parts. Again though, that's me editorializing. It does bring me though to what I think is going to be the big strategy in keeping costs low: outsourcing. This is more in speculation territory, but it appears the plan for id Software going forward is to outsource support studios and independent contractors to help finish their games, which is a regular practice in AAA game development and is something id has regularly done in the past decade. Although in this case, they'll lean on this practice a lot more. The thing to keep in mind is that a salaried employee is expensive, especially within Microsoft. On top of being paid year-round, they also receive benefits like healthcare, have 401ks the company pays into, not to mention infrastructure overhead for keeping them in an office, supply them equipment, i.e. computers, as well as HR staff to manage them. Independent contractors don't require most or any of that. They are paid for the job they are hired to do in a set period of time, and that's it. 18 months in fact, as per Microsoft policy. Contractors are cheaper all around. And then of course, there's also the matter of IDTech. In the immediate aftermath of the layoffs, a large portion of the outrage was focused on the fact that majority of the IDTech team was let go at the Dallas office, with reports that only 2 members of it remained. Referring to the credits list of Doom: The Dark Ages Revelations, there were around 23 people working on IDTech in the Dallas office. For a reminder, IDTech is the proprietary engine that has powered all id Software titles since John Carmack designed the initial groundbreaking versions for the original Doom and Quake, with CryEngine designer Diego Souza taking over for him in 2014 to design IDTech 6. He has continued designing IDTech ever since, with the latest version, IDTech 8, powering Doom: The Dark Ages. IDTech 6, 7, and 8 have been highly regarded as some of the best and most well-optimized first-person shooter engines in the industry, not to mention the engine's historical significance. So the avalanche of outrage for the IDTech team being let go was understandable, especially with rumors that Microsoft was sunsetting the engine and forcing id to adopt Unreal. In the torrent of the public outcry, Microsoft was the first to break silence, mainly addressing the IDTech rumors. In a statement they supplied to media outlets, they said, quote, "There are dozens of people working on IDTech across multiple locations. Reports that there's only 1 person left in Texas are inaccurate." Well, yeah, because there's 2. Allegedly. Next came id Software's response that they posted to social media, and the headline there is that while they were affected, they still had the crew they needed to build the games and tech they're known for, and that, quote, "The team today is about the same size as we were when making Doom 2016. Then came a response from id's creative director Hugo Martin during a Slayers Club livestream. Here's the clip.
I'm not saying anything new.
Yeah.
Our team, no, there's been reports that like we've been, nerfed into the ground and gutted, and we have 50 people, and that's not true. We're the size we were when we made Doom 2016, and IDTech is very much alive and well. You have to understand, we have IDTech engineers both in Frankfurt and at Machine Games. We collaborate quite a bit, so the IDTech is there, the Doom team is here, and we're excited to work on, to share with you guys more of what we're working on in the future when it is appropriate and approved.
While Hugo's assurances were enough to calm the nerves of some id fans, many met Microsoft's ids and his statements with skepticism. Before we get into that though, regarding the IDTech of it all, at the moment it does appear the rumors of it being sunsetted were overblown. First, many, including myself, didn't realize that there is another id Software office in Frankfurt, Germany, that is dedicated to the development and support of IDTech. Yes, they were affected by the layoffs. The 12-person office lost 6 people, half their staff, which absolutely sucks. However, at the moment, they remain in operation and working on the engine. And Machine Games, who used IDTech for all of their Wolfenstein titles, including their 2024 Indiana Jones game, was not affected by the layoffs and has IDTech engineers on staff. Last, Thiago Sousa is still reportedly working for id. He was not affected by the layoffs, and if there was an intention to shelve IDTech, it's highly unlikely he would stick around. Granted, that could change in the coming months, but basically if Thiago leaves and someone isn't immediately hired to succeed him, then that's the biggest sign that IDTech is dead. Until then though, I think it's safe to assume its next iteration is in development with him at the helm. Echoing what I said earlier, I think the Xbox executives in charge of these layoffs determined the minimum amount of people they needed to develop and maintain IDTech and cut the rest, and that the most important personnel for that, in their minds, were not the ones in the id Dallas office. Now, before we move on from this point, I want to stress that while I do think the rumors are overblown and that for the moment IDTech is here to stay, if I was proven wrong on anything in this video, this is the one I would be the least surprised. From what I understand, the Dallas team were the leads on the engine's development, and as I'll elaborate more on in a bit, it looks like the personnel that were let go were crucial to the engine's development and upkeep, and that losing them will be devastating for it. And it appears that Microsoft wasn't totally aware or understanding of that. So there's a chance IDTech could go away simply because Microsoft unknowingly crippled its development. Ultimately though, we have to wait and see. But I wanted to put that out there in case the rug is pulled out from under me. When it comes to id's same team size as Doom 2016 stuff, that's where things start to get a little fuzzy. Referencing the credits for Doom 2016 via Moby Games, there are 163 id employees listed. To be clear, that is not counting the Bethesda and ZeniMax personnel, as well as the support studios also listed in the credits. This is just the id team as listed. Here's where the fuzzy comes in. Apparently, those 163 credits account for everyone who was involved in Doom 2016's development working at id, which was around 7 years. This includes the years spent on the scrap Doom 4, which was famously rebooted into the Doom 2016 we know today. According to some sources, there was a massive turnover and exodus at id around 2010-2011, and there are claims that when Doom 2016 shipped, the internal id team was around 75 to 80 people. And here's where it gets even fuzzier. When we take into account the 185 employee headcount reported from id's unionizing last December, it contradicts id's claims that their team size is about the same as Doom 2016. With the layoffs, it should be 49. Something is off here. So I put the 185 person reporting aside and decided to count the id Software employees for Doom the Dark Ages Revelations myself, based off the Moby Games credit listing, and I got 217 employees. And then I did the same for the Doom the Dark Ages vanilla game and got 221 employees. Obviously, those are more than 185. Granted, you should take my count with a grain of salt. I could have overlooked something, or maybe counted people who were contractors. Maybe id did more hiring that they didn't include in the CWA headcount for whatever reason. Either way, there's some room for error here, and I want to be clear on that. One thing is certain though, and it's that 136 people just got laid off at id Software Dallas. That is backed up by the Texas state government. And if we suppose the 185 person count was inaccurate and my 217 person count is, well then yeah, there are more than 50 people working at id right now. There's 81. Aha! So that number lines up with what was supposedly the internal id Software headcount in 2016. Here's the problem though. Even if id's current team size is the same as when Doom 2016 shipped, it's still not a reassurance. In fact, it's a very flawed reassurance that might be predictive of a problematic development for the next Doom title. For one, if id indeed has the same team size as Doom 2016, Doom 2016, as the name implies, was released 10 years ago. And the fact of the matter is, the demands of game development have only increased since then, not to mention the scope of Doom titles. And the next Doom game is more than likely targeting next-generation hardware. And as every new hardware generation proves, next-gen games demand more time and resources. So the idea that id is going to be able to pull off a next-generation Doom title with the same team size as Doom 2016, which itself was much smaller than the team size compared to Doom Eternal and Doom the Dark Ages, doesn't really compute. Even if they were able to make the next Doom with less scope compared to the Dark Ages and stuck with their current generation of id Tech, it's not a guarantee they're going to be able to pull it off in a way that's going to make Microsoft happy, or at least pull it off in the amount of time they've been able to develop Doom games in the last 10 years. It points to what I was saying earlier, that the development for the next Doom and future id titles is going to rely on outsourcing. Although in fairness, Bethesda will likely shift the Machine Games team over to assist, along with other studios under the ZeniMax banner. But overall, outsourcing is looking like the core strategy here. However, judging by some of the recent statements by former and current id employees, a lot was lost in these layoffs that outsourcing simply can't fix. In an article on Game Developer from Chris Kerr, he claimed that multiple anonymous sources representing current and former id team members reached out to him, claiming that while they didn't disagree with the id team being the size it was during 2016, they did feel that Martin was misrepresenting the truth, with a common point being the huge amount of accumulated knowledge and talent lost in the layoffs. One current employee claimed that, quote, many who were laid off were upset by those comments and saw it as viewing their contributions as insignificant to the success of our games. In truth, the Doom team is half here, half thrown away. That same source continued to say it's also of note that Doom 2016's development was brutal. With the infamous Doom 4 reboot included, it took about 7 years and an absurd amount of crunch to finish. The icing on the cake is that there were several key individuals who worked an unsafe amount of hours to make that happen, who were also a part of the layoffs. In another article penned by Kerr, another source told him in regards to the engine that they've just gotten rid of all the people who could ever fix, maintain, or change id Tech. The institutional knowledge that has been lost on the id Tech side is immense. I cannot imagine a path forward where they make another game in id Tech. And in a recent interview with id programmer Chris Hayes, he described that id before the layoffs was an unusually small AAA studio whose advantage was an immensely experienced team that had worked together for years, and that this layoff has deeply hurt that advantage, damaged entire disciplines and functions. Other sources that spoke to Kerr further elaborated on 2016's development in terms of the staff, saying that id ramped up hiring tremendously around 2013 to get 2016 out the door, among them being Tiago Souza, who brought with him the Crytek engine team, something they described as a miracle, along with contracting to support studios. Escalation Studios, which consisted of 21 people, later purchased by Bethesda and renamed Bethesda Dallas, they're the ones who handled SnapMap, and Certain Affinity, which was made up of around 140 developers at the time. They assisted with 2016's multiplayer mode. So even if id had 80 people for Doom 2016, they still had an additional 160 contractors assisting them for the final push. A final push that, as mentioned before, required an unhealthy amount of crunch from their most talented developers. If these sources are accurate, it really highlights that id is misrepresenting this situation here. While they can try to calm nerves with their messaging on team size, the comparison to the development of 2016 is simply not appropriate, and the loss of talent here really creates a lot of uncertainty for the quality of the next Doom title. To be clear, I don't want to paint Hugo and the id higher-ups as villains in this. They're dealing with this mess too, and honestly, I don't blame them for how they've handled it. I don't agree at all with their messaging and comparing it to the Doom 2016 development, but I can't imagine there's some degree of pressure from their parent companies to message this stuff in a particular way. They also have to act in a way that's best for their next product and their team. Hugo is in a role of leadership at id, being a director as well as co-studio lead. He can't be coming out and saying how horrible this stuff is, at least publicly, because it risks demotivating his current team as well as disenfranchising the id player base. We also have to consider that it could put his job in jeopardy too. Not to mention, this whole thing just made their jobs a lot harder. They have to deal with meeting Microsoft's reset demands, as well as taking on what is probably going to be a challenging development for their next title. Managing new teams of contractors they might not know or have any experience working with. Contractors that will have to be trained on id Tech, which could take time, and adjust to id's workflow and standards. Time they might not have if those contractors are only around for 18 months. I can't imagine that will go as smoothly as working with a team of people you've known for over a decade and know the ins and outs of id tools and workflow. Frankly, I'd be shocked if some of the id leadership doesn't leave in the next few years. To wrap this up, and thank you for sticking with me so far, I know this was a long one, it's that with how heinous these layoffs have been, as far as we can tell, it is not being turned into a support studio and is moving on to their next Doom title. And IDTech is safe for the moment, despite losing some crucial personnel in its upkeep and development. But I am worried. No matter how you shake it, this is an end of a great era for id and the beginning of a new one with a different makeup for their team that leaves a lot of uncertainty. Sure, the core leadership and creatives remain, but they've lost a wealth of experience and skill sets with the people Microsoft have axed. And as far as Xbox goes, I have little confidence their reset strategy is going to work. Squeezing more out of their people while also drastically and bluntly cutting jobs just seems like a recipe for failure. I really hope I'm wrong and that they succeed, for the sake of their gaming properties and more for the sake of the people that work on them. I really hope I look back on this episode of Boom someday and go, wow, was I off, and thank God I was. But overall, I just find this whole situation sad. While it's easy to go down the rabbit hole of cold business strategies and IP speculation, at the end of the day, there are a lot of people that just had their livelihoods interrupted. People with mortgages, families to provide for, medical expenses, you name it, thrust out to look for work during one of the worst and uncertain times for their industry, with jobs becoming scarcer and scarcer. And at no fault of their own, mind you. This ultimately happened because their parent company made some bad financial bets. And if you want to take a broader picture, because that same parent company is trying to funnel more money into technology that has only succeeded at giving us generative slop and driving up our power bills. The shiny new thing to make the stock market happy until it doesn't. And what makes that sting even worse is that these people were given the boot right when they finished what many consider their finest work yet. In recent days, there was a social media post from Andrew Willis, a producer at id who was instrumental in getting the company unionized. He's been very outspoken, to say the least, on this whole debacle, but in this particular post, he just mourns the situation. Quote, "My plan was to work at id until I retired. I loved that place. It was the best place I've ever worked. I love the people that I got to work with and spend time with, like they were my family. Even the occasional disagreement or argument felt different. It felt like arguing with my brothers rather than some stranger in an office building. I refuse to believe we did not make enough money to support ourselves. I believe and continue to believe that our studio was cut in half because somewhere in an office I've never been to, someone I've never met, decided that the amount of money we kicked up to executives was simply not enough. And because that dollar amount wasn't enough, this person I'll never meet in a building I'll never see was fine with destroying people's careers, their livelihoods, their ability to take care of their families, and their ability to feel secure. This cannot continue." And look, I'll be the first to admit, I don't have all the information. There's a lot we don't know and understand, and my speculations are just that, speculations. But regardless of what the exact equation is for what happened here, the end result and its consequences are crystal clear and it's bullshit. These are real people that have been affected, and it's yet another example of a AAA gaming industry that is falling apart. It shouldn't have happened at id Software, it shouldn't happen anywhere. And yeah, I think that's worth understanding to the best of our abilities and calling out in some sort of effort to change it. We should try. And with our news recap concluded, it's now time to look at the FPS releases from this last July. As always, if there was something I overlooked, be sure to shout it out in the comments. Fight back against extinction in All Tomorrow's Invasion, an endless survival wave-based shooter that released for free on July 2nd. A thief-style stealth title where you must sneak into a base of cultists and steal all their stuff. Turskar Isle released on the 2nd. Take on the vermin menace encroaching on your farm in Vermin Protocol, released on the 2nd. Also on the 2nd, Hunt Showdown received the Twice Renegade DLC pack, featuring the new mercenary Hunter. Cicadia is a first-person roguelite where you must fight through a nest of bugs, collect bile, and uncover the hidden truths of a failing empire. It released for free on the 3rd. Bepe War is a quirky and chaotic war simulator with characters and vehicles that kinda look like toys. It released on July 3rd. Released into early access, Sendeo Complex is a fast-paced old-school FPS set in an interconnected world. It released for free on July 4th. SOR OP Dark Shades, yeah that sure rolls off the tongue, is a realistic PvP shooter rocking 25 maps and a variety of modes like Team Deathmatch, Domination, and Zombies. It dropped into early access on the 6th. A wild-looking FPS bullet heaven where power-ups stack infinitely. Demon Siege released on the 6th. Doom the Dark Ages Revelations dropped on the 7th. I have a 2-part review out for it, one for the base game, the other for the endgame. You can find them linked in the description. Running, Gunning, Reading. Silicon Scars is an old-school marathon-esque shooter full of sci-fi boom shootery. It also released on the 7th. Originally released back in 2005, Neuro Hunter is an immersive sim taking a page from classics like Deus Ex and System Shock. It was re-released on Steam on the 7th. Cyberpsychosis revved up the chainsaw for pseudo 3D FPS action on July 9th. Hollow Forge is a stealth FPS featuring fast action and an atmospheric, immersive world. It snuck out on the 9th. On July 10th, we got Shrapnel's Sentinel, an arena FPS all about defending the final pillar of reality. Angels Fall First, the large-scale multiplayer FPS where you battle in space, hit 1.0 on July 10th after 10 years of early access. On the 13th, CNS Games released Zombie City Together, a co-op shooter where you take on zombies with your friends. In the last few months, CNS has also put out Zombie Wasteland Together, Dead Station Together, Casino Empire Together, Hunt Asylum Together, Samurai Fights Together. I think I'm detecting a pattern. A dark and bloody retro FPS, Maledictor launched into early access on the 14th, pitting players against crazy cultists and demons. A tactical FPS in the vein of classic Rainbow Six and coming from a few of its developers. Ground Branch launched on July 16th. Sporting a surreal PS1 art style, Blue Worm is a first-person Souls-like that released on the 16th. A sci-fi shooter where time is your biggest resource and your greatest enemy, Project Raze entered early access on the 16th. A throwback to Wolfenstein 3D with a Soviet twist. Bolsheviction 2 was released on the 17th. Survive Zombies with scavenging, puzzle solving, and good old-fashioned bullets, and Last Alive released on the 17th. Cultic was released on PlayStation and Xbox on the 23rd. Finally, a Switch 2 version was planned to drop on the same day, but has been delayed so it can be optimized further. No release date on that yet. Rated S for silly and released for free on the 20th, Kato Pew Pew is an adorable multiplayer FPS that can be played in either standard or VR. A fast-paced espionage shooter with tactical stealth action, Unsight launched on the 20th. An old-school survival horror with on-rail shooting mechanics, Meat Hook released on the 21st. A co-op zombie shooter set in the aftermath of the apocalypse, codenamed Cure 2 has you blasting through legions of zombies with dynamic objectives. It shambled out for free on the 24th. An extraction shooter set in a Soviet ghost town, Dreadweave dropped into early access on the 24th. A zombie survival game with slick action movie moves, Code Black got us taking out zombie hordes on the 24th. Freaking finally! 2 years after its first episode, Fallen Aces Episode 2 finally launched for more noir ImSim action, with new features like a car and a beefy babe to help you fight. Tachyon Fire dropped on the 27th, a balls-to-the-wall movement shooter with a surreal art style. Inspired by the military shooters of the past, as its name implies, Fire on Fight is an online multiplayer shooter that looks like it was ripped straight from COD multiplayer from 15 years ago. It launched on the 27th. Halo Campaign Evolved brought back everyone's favorite chief and ring on the 28th. And on PlayStation 5, which must mean hell froze over. A classic arena shooter inspired by the classics of the 90s, Sind Arena boomed out on the 28th. Also on the 28th is Heart Dust, a multiplayer horror shooter inspired by early 2000s FPSs. An FPS bullet hell in a curvy geometric world, Orbital Hell brought the polygons on the 28th. Survive monstrous horrors in the tall grass, an outfield which freaked us out on the 29th. A blast from the past entering early access on the 29th, Sudden Attack 0 Point is a fast-paced tactical online shooter, reviving the classic Korean online shooter from 2005. A Resident Evil-esque survival horror set aboard an ocean liner, Sonara the Sacrament brought the summer spookiness on July 30th. A parkour-focused online FPS rocking diverse weaponry, 5 game modes, and over 20 maps, Skill Wars slid onto Steam on the 30th. And finally, bringing ultra-fast game-breaking roguelike Chaos, Steel Judgment shot into early access on the 31st. And before we wrap up, let's look at some of the FPSs coming in August. Kicking off the month is Fire State, an online bodycam style shooter with PvP and co-op modes. A bite-sized speed shooter where you run and gun, or perhaps fall and gun, down a huge skyscraper. Escape from the Black Monolith falls onto Steam on the 3rd for free. A one-hit kill comedy FPS that looks all sorts of silly. PIH 2 brings the pig battles on the 4th. It Consumes was slated to be coming on July 24th, but it looks like it got slightly delayed to August 4th. I really like the demo for this, and I'm looking forward to its full version. Gunstoppable, the momentum-fueled roguelite, finally drops on the 5th. I've played a few demos of this and have really seen it grow a lot. Looking forward to seeing how it does. Hold off the infected hordes until help arrives with observation and bullets, when Quarantine Zombies Prologue releases on the 5th. Okay, so this is a little unusual for me, but Night Dive Studios traditionally shadow drops a new remaster from the classic id catalog during QuakeCon, which is being held from August 6th through the 9th. They've done this the last 4 years in a row, and for the 5th, a lot of signs point to it being one of the Wolfenstein games, probably Wolfenstein 2009. Either way, expect something from them anywhere from August 6 to 9, and if it doesn't happen, well, I'm sorry. A roguelike deck-building FPS that promises to be a dopamine machine. Lucky Shot is looking to addict us on the 7th. Vivid Intrusion gets all surreal on the 7th as well. I enjoyed the demo for this one, and I'm looking forward to seeing how it shapes up. Oh wow, look, another one from CNS Games. This time it's Hunt Skeletons Together. I wonder how this one compares to the dozen other Together games they've put out in the last few months. The wait has been long, but Agent 64 is finally releasing on the 11th. This is a throwback to GoldenEye and Perfect Dark, aiming to be the spiritual follow-up we've always dreamed about. Looking forward to playing more co-op in this one. Okay, last month I erroneously said that Hell Let Loose Vietnam was releasing in July, but then it got delayed and I didn't catch it. But now, I hope Hell Let Loose Vietnam is coming on August 13th. The Corrupted is a PvE shooter promising intense boss encounters and rewarding progression. It launches on the 13th. A splat-tastic horror FPS, Gutted Infected Crypts will have us dismembering rotten corpses on the 17th. In development for quite some time now, Twisted Tower is finally coming out on the 18th, throwing us into a hellish carnival full of brutal action. A blisteringly fast FPS where you play as an ape, Hyperprimate sprints out on the 19th. Historical World War I shooter Gallipoli brings us back to the Ottoman fronts on August 20th. A co-op roguelite, Iron Sand is a sci-fi FPS where you take on colossal enemies in the far reaches of space. It launches on the 20th. A retro survival horror set in an Eastern Bloc town, Iron Blight has us searching for our missing wife on August 24th. A cutesy, spooky tower defense FPS, Ghost Villa launches on the 24th. A 6-player survival horror set in a colossal maze, Inferno Protocol is looking to get us lost on the 28th. A roguelike looter shooter set in a dystopian metropolis, Fracture Point releases on the 28th. Also on the 28th is Reconquista, a fast-paced boom shoot with a focus on melee weapons and randomly generated levels. And that will do it for this State of the Boom. If you enjoyed the video, please like, subscribe, share, and comment. It's a huge help for the algorithm. I'm Kirk, and thank you for watching this video. Stay safe out there.